This video is about
history.
Thanks, kiddo. Hi, everybody. As you can see, today's topic is a bit of a dark one. Generally, when people learn about World War II, they learn about the causes, the countries involved, the significant battles, and the eventual defeats of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. What doesn't usually get a lot of airtime is the effects of World War II on civilian populations. So that's what I want to talk about here. Some people have a romantic notion of the way wars were fought before the 20th century, with armies facing each other on the field of battle without any effects on the civilian populations nearby. When we think of warfare in this way, what we miss is that those armies had to travel to get to those battlefields. They had to march along roads and through towns to get to those battlefields, and there were civilian populations on those roads, in those towns and villages. Those armies needed food to eat and places to sleep, and those often came at the expense of those civilian populations. There is no doubt that warfare has always affected civilian populations that were near a battlefield. Like many of the wars that preceded it, World War II was fought in fields. Sometimes. Unlike many of the wars that preceded it, World War II was fought in cities and towns. Civilians became military targets in a way, or rather on a scale, that humans had not seen before. In this video, we are going to take a brief look at some of the ways that World War II armies fought a war against civilians. So our learning goals are going to be pretty straightforward. We're going to identify examples of military actions taken against civilians during wartime, and then hopefully by the end, you should be able to describe the effects of war on civilian populations. Now, with the descriptions I'm going to give, I'm going to try to balance being brief with being detailed. One of the overarching points here is that in the 20th century, humans seem to get really, really good, and tragically so, at inventing things to kill other human beings. And with that cheery thought, let's get started. There are many, many examples of civilians getting caught in the crossfire or crosshairs of different armies during World War II. I'm going to focus your attention on 4. The Nanjing Massacre, the Battle of Britain and Nazi rocket attacks on the UK, the Allied bombing campaign of Germany, and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Perhaps the most obvious example of war on civilians during World War II is the Holocaust. I'm not going to talk about the Holocaust in this video for a couple of reasons, the main one being that I believe it would be a disservice to try to rush through a description of it in this video format. I've deliberately chosen 2 examples from each side of the war. I've done this to remind us that war is a hellish experience for everyone involved. And one last word before we get started. Some of the images in this video may be disturbing. They include the results of large-scale bombing and evidence of torture and murder. So if there is an image that comes up that is not for you, please fast forward to the next screen or slide. Our first example is the Nanjing Massacre. Now, usually when we in the Western Hemisphere learn about World War II, we learn that it starts in 1939 with the German invasion of Poland. This example, however, takes place before that, and I'm including it in a study of World War II because more historians are recognizing that events in Asia related to Japan's expansion were the start of a chain of events that are directly connected to the war. I'm going to list a bunch of dates here on the screen, but don't worry, we're going to go through all of them. The historical context for the Nanjing Massacre goes way back to the beginning of the 1900s or the 20th century with the Japanese invasion of the Korean Peninsula. That puts the Japanese military on mainland or continental Asia. The second big piece of historical context here is that both China and Japan were original members of the League of Nations, which was formed after World War I to prevent further or more war, to ensure peace. In 1931, the Japanese military invades the Chinese territory of Manchuria. This is a big deal because one member of the League of Nations committed to peace has invaded another member of the League of Nations. So China requests the League's help. and they send an investigative team. Here's a picture of them arriving in Shanghai. By the time the investigators have arrived in 1932, Japan has already established a puppet government in the territory, and they are even now calling the territory by a new name, Manchukuo. The investigators go about their job. They speak to witnesses, they talk to representatives of both countries, and they write up a report and recommendations. Another 6 months go by before the League formally accepts the investigators' report, and they order Japan to return the territory to China. And in a move that surprises everyone, except perhaps the Japanese and the Chinese, Japan refuses to do so. And then they quit the League of Nations. They just walk out. And since Japan is no longer a member of the League, the international organization doesn't think it can do anything else because the dispute is no longer between two member nations, and so that feels like it is outside the League of Nations jurisdiction. The lack of a meaningful response from the League of Nations demonstrates the organization's inability to intervene or stop fighting, even between its members. This lack of a response demonstrated to people around the world that the League of Nations was not something to be worried about. Among the people who take notice are Benito Mussolini, the leader of fascist Italy, and Adolf Hitler, who actually had just been named Chancellor of Germany a couple of months earlier. So that's our historical context. In 1937, the Japanese attack the city of Shanghai, and after taking the city, they begin marching towards Nanjing, the capital city of China before it was moved to Beijing. When the Japanese soldiers marched towards Nanjing, they were allowed to steal whatever they wanted from Chinese civilians. They were also not punished by the superior officers if they sexually assaulted or raped anyone. This lack of a punishment was interpreted by the soldiers as permission to do whatever they wanted to the Chinese civilians. The result was a combined military operation and humanitarian debacle. Japanese soldiers had implied permission to attack anyone and everyone in whatever manner they chose. There are stories of Japanese soldiers having contests to see who could kill more Chinese people, soldiers or citizens. When the Japanese army took the city of Nanjing in the winter of 1937, it started a 6-week period known as the Nanjing Massacre. These images show some of the details of that massacre. In the top left corner, you can see a Chinese civilian with a bayonet wound to the back of their neck. Bayonet is the long, almost sword-like object at the end of a rifle. The story is that a Japanese soldier tried to cut this man's head off starting at the back. In the top right corner, we can see Japanese soldiers conducting what was called a bayonet drill or practice on Chinese civilians who were still alive. And then in the bottom left corner, we have dead Chinese citizens who are left in the streets. It was too unsafe for Chinese civilians, for other civilians, to go out into the street to retrieve these bodies because the Japanese soldiers who were patrolling the streets might attack or kill them when they were out there. The numbers are staggering. Estimates are that within a 6-week period, 100,000 to 300,000 people were killed, and that Japanese soldiers raped between 20,000 and 80,000 women and girls. The massacre only ended when the Japanese government assigned officials to manage the city and replaced the occupying Japanese military. Our next example is the Battle of Britain, which occurred between July and October of 1940. The brief historical context here is that Nazi Germany invaded France in May of 1940, and within 6 weeks, France had surrendered. Hitler then hesitated to invade England. He was hoping to arrange a ceasefire or a peace treaty with them. England, however, communicated that they were definitely not interested in peace, so Germany began to plan an invasion. The head of the German Air Force claimed that he could bomb the English into submission, so Hitler gave him the chance. The goal was to destroy Britain's ability and willingness to fight so that Germany could successfully invade. For 4 months, the German Air Force sent bombers to destroy targets in England and Scotland almost every night, or every night that weather allowed. At first, the German Air Force focused on military targets, like military bases. When that strategy proved unsuccessful, the Germans switched to attacking civilian targets. The time period is known in England as the Blitz. The heat map on the right gives you an indication of the frequency with which different parts of the UK were attacked or bombed. The deeper the color, the more frequent the number of attacks, and you can see the intensity of attacks around London, Liverpool, as far north as Glasgow, and the south coast, Plymouth, and also here. There were military targets in these areas, including things like factories, manufacturing centers that were building engines or bullets or airplanes or other military vehicles. These are also major civilian areas. And they are bombed, repeated, as I said, every time the weather would allow. And if you just pay attention to this, all of this area, all of the civilians in this part of England, or the United Kingdom rather, are at risk or exposed to risk from the air. The map on the left is meant to indicate sort of the defensive arrangements. Okay? Primarily what I want to focus on are these red lines. They are, as you can see, the ranges of different levels of radar. And radar technology was an integral part of the UK defense during the Battle of Britain. The way it would work is radar was used to determine the number of German airplanes coming in, and to estimate the intended target of those warplanes. The radar stations would then communicate that information to military command, and military command would do two things. First, they would alert defensive squadrons so they could take off and fight the Germans in the air. And the second thing they would do is military command would alert the towns and cities that appeared to be the targets. Air raid sirens would go off, British civilians would stop what they were doing and then try to find shelter. Some civilians had their own shelters. They may just go into the basement of their homes. In a city like London, the most common bomb shelter was actually subway stations. For months, the Germans sent wave after wave of bombers and fighter airplanes, day and night. A combination of British, Canadian, and Polish pilots defended the skies over Britain. Both sides experienced devastating losses. On the civilian side, in England, approximately 43,000 civilians were killed during the Blitz. Almost half of the country's civilian deaths for the entire war happened in just those few months. In the end, the Germans were unable to control the skies over England, and so they abandoned their plans to invade. Even though Germany's plans for an invasion of England fizzled, they continued to attack England in an effort to disrupt their war effort by destroying factories, by targeting infrastructure, and by targeting civilian workers or laborers. German scientists had been working on the development of rockets since the 1920s. They used this research to develop two long-range missiles or rockets, the Model V1 and the Model V2. The V2 was the more sophisticated of the two models. It was actually the first object human beings put into outer space. They were able to launch it high enough on a test flight that it went into outer space. It was about 14 meters high and carried a ton of explosives. That's about 2,000 pounds of explosives. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the V2 rocket was that it could move faster than the speed of sound. So no one could hear the missile approaching. It would just hit and explode. It was terrifying. These rockets were launched from continental Europe and aimed at targets in England. Targeted is maybe an exaggeration. They were pointed at the UK, and they had a rough idea of the distance they would travel and where they would roughly land. These rockets were launched from continental Europe. Think about this. These rockets were launched from continental Europe and aimed at targets in England. The V2 rocket could make this trip across the English Channel in just 5 minutes. It was virtually silent and extremely deadly. It was just terrifying for civilians within its range. More than 2,400 V-1 rockets made it through air defenses, killing more than 6,100 people. Over 3,100 V-2 rockets were fired, killing over 2,700 more people and wounding a further 6,500. This map details the impact sites of just the V-2 rockets fired towards the UK. Okay, just the sheer number should jump off the screen at you. The V-1 rocket was slower than the V-2, and so anti-aircraft guns were sometimes able to shoot down the V-1 rockets. And in other instances, some airplane pilots actually tried to knock the V-1 rocket off course by flying next to it, getting one of their airplane's wings under the wing of the rocket, and then jerking their plane to tip the V-1 rocket off course. These rockets introduced a new, terrifying reality for civilians. They could be attacked and killed at any moment from something launched 1,000 kilometers away, and they wouldn't even hear it coming. Partly in response to the Blitz, the Allied air forces started making plans to bomb military targets in Germany and civilian targets like factories that made weapons for the Germans. Early in the war, the Allies did not have any bombers that could fly all the way to England, to Germany, and back. However, over time, new bombers with better engines were built that could get there. Just as the Nazis had done, British and American air forces switched from bombing military targets to bombing everything. An incendiary bomb, was one of the deadliest bombs that the Allies dropped on German cities. The bomb ignited a fire when it exploded. This picture is of the city of Hanover, Germany, during a firebombing. You can see an Allied bomber silhouetted against the fires burning across the city. There are two infamous examples of firebombing. One is Allied firebombing of Tokyo, and the other is the firebombing of the German city of Dresden in February of 1945. This picture was taken after the bombing. The objective, it would seem, was to make the city as uninhabitable as possible. The fire was so big and so intense that it was actually sucking up the oxygen in the city and suffocating its residents. As many as 25,000 Germans were killed over the course of 2 nights of firebombing. The firebombing of Dresden has become particularly well known because it is part of a famous book called Slaughterhouse-Five. Because so many records were destroyed in the bombings, which is not a surprise given the devastation that we can see here, it's difficult to get an accurate number of German civilian casualties, but estimates range between 350,000 and 635,000 over the entire Allied bombing campaign. Our final example of the war on civilians is the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan by the United States Air Force. For years, the Allies had been working with physicists. Some of them had actually been working on the rocket program in Germany before the war to develop an atomic bomb. By the summer of 1945, most of Japan's military gains had been lost. The only territory left for the Allies to conquer was the home islands of Japan. One military option was to launch an invasion of these home islands, which are shown on the map here. American generals estimated that the invasion would result in about 500,000 or 500,000 American casualties. Another option was to drop these new bombs on Japanese targets and see how the Japanese would react. The first bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. This is a photograph taken from the airplane that dropped the atomic bomb. The photograph was taken 30 seconds after the bomb dropped. The mushroom cloud had already reached a height of over 30,000 feet. And for any Canadian audiences out there, that is about the height of 17 CN towers. This photograph was taken about 3 hours after the bomb had detonated. Another haunting image of the atomic bombs is the appearance of what looks like shadows on the street. When the bomb dropped, the intense light and heat spread out from the explosion point and bleached every surface. Objects and people in the path of the light and heat shielded things behind them. In other words, the eerie shadows that we can see are actually how the sidewalk and building looked more or less before the nuclear blast. It's just that the rest of the surfaces were bleached, making the regularly colored areas look like a dark shadow. For me, images like this generate, in my mind, the idea of an elderly person going about their day, standing at the bottom of some steps, cane in one hand, and perhaps holding a package in the other because the shadow of their other arm is shorter, so I imagine it being bent at the elbow. In an instant, that human being is killed, and all that's left of them is this haunting shadow. These aerial photographs were taken before and after the bombing of Hiroshima. In the before image, you can make out buildings and roads of various sizes. In the after, it's as though a giant hand has wiped most of this section of the city off the face of the earth. In this color image, taken 6 months after the bombing, you can see the devastating effects and just how uninhabitable the space was afterward. You can see the same results from these before and after photographs of Nagasaki. You can actually see in the after shot the elevation of the land, which is obscured a little bit in the before picture. This image was taken 15 minutes after the bomb detonated at Nagasaki. To give you a sense of the size of the mushroom cloud, the photograph was taken from about 10 kilometers away. If you want some perspective, pause the video and use a map application to look up a location 10 kilometers away from where you are right now. Then imagine seeing a cloud that large, that far away. This final image shows, like the one on the previous slide, the same result of buildings and people being seemingly wiped off the face of the earth. The best estimates that we have are that the bombing at Nagasaki killed 80,000 people. Before I close, I want to acknowledge that I've focused on the tremendous loss of life caused by these events and the loss of life of people who are not enlisted in the armed services or fighting on the front lines. If we take the minimum estimated casualties from just the events in this video, we are looking at approximately 772,000 deaths. But the damage goes far beyond that. Physically, entire cities were burned to the ground. Think about it. Homes, apartment buildings, schools, farmland, stores, places of work, and infrastructure like sewers and water treatment facilities. All of these things and more were destroyed. For those who survived these events, the spaces that they knew were gone, and there was almost no way to rebuild because they were in the middle of a war zone, in the middle of a war. Food and water supplies were destroyed or, at best, disrupted, so hunger, homelessness, and disease became new threats and took more lives. Also, given what we've learned in the last decades about mental health, it does not take much imagination on our part to think how psychologically traumatic war on civilians was and continues to be. If we look at the present, we can see that civilians are still experiencing the risk and hardship that war has brought them for hundreds of years. And for those of you in a course that's studying continuity and change, that's a freebie for you. This brings us to the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.